All right, this is going to be a very short video. Mostly, I just want to direct your attention to some information that you're going to need to know to write a descriptive report of a variable once you have generated output and numbers and pictures for that variable. Okay, so I've given you a list, kind of step by step, of how to write a report for a more general audience when you have information about a single variable that you want to share. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go through this list, and then I'm going to direct you to some examples that I've written that have used the instruction on this list to compose a descriptive report of a single variable. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do when you provide a report of a variable, a written report, is you give some general information about the respondents. So N, right, how many people there were, and some basic information about where they were from, etc. And to show what that looks like in an example variable. So this is the variable COVID worried. The first part of this paragraph, which corresponds with number 1 in the list, is, so they're saying, 194 introductory stat students who completed an online survey responded to the question, and that's number 1, right? A sentence that gives some general information about respondents, how many of them there were, where they were from, etc. Okay, number 2. Then for the variable that you're reporting, describe the exact question wording and the values. So for this, it's saying, so they responded to the question, how worried are you about COVID on a scale from 1, which is not at all worried, to 7, which is a great deal worried. Number 3 is only applicable if the variable is an average computed from multiple questions. So that's like the average self-esteem variable we were working with before. So if the variable you're reporting on is a computed average variable, then you want to describe how the variable was computed and give some examples of the questions that were used in the average calculation. So that doesn't apply to the COVID worried variable because that's a single variable, but you can see in the second example that I've given you, that is the average self-esteem variable. So here's how I would do point 3. Okay, so it's kind of combined with giving information about the question and the values. So they're saying responded to 5 questions assessing self-esteem. And then again, you give specific examples of some of the questions that were used. Okay, so remember there were those 5 questions about self-esteem. And if you were to go back to the data set, you would see that one of them was, I feel I have a number of good qualities. One of them was, I take on a positive attitude toward myself. So you don't need to list all of them, but you just want to give your reader a sense of the type of questions that there were. Okay. And then you're, again, so on a scale from 1 to 4, and you're specifically saying the average of those 5 questions was computed. Okay. So that's what you would do if you had a variable that was the average of multiple variables. All right. So now we've got 1, 2, and 3 covered. Number 4, you were going to report the representative value, which is typically the mean for numeric variables. But if you have nominal variables or ordinal with text data, you're going to be reporting the mode. And then you're also going to interpret the representative value in the context of the question wording and or value labels. Okay, so here's what I mean by that. And I'll show you the COVID worried example. Okay, so you're interpreting the mean in the context of the values, right? So what this means is, so you already said that this question was asked or answered rather on a scale from 1 to 7. Okay, so when you are reporting the mean, you're kind of reminding readers on this 1 to 7 scale, the mean was 2.73. So then they can kind of keep in mind, okay, so the mean is 2.73, but it's on the 1 to 7 scale. So this is on the low end, right? Like people aren't worried very much because the mean was fairly low. All right. So now I want to go through another example that shows a slightly different way of how to interpret the mean in the context of the values that the questions were answered on, the response scale. Okay, and that is for the average self-esteem question. Okay, so the average of the 5 questions was computed, and then the mean for the average was 3.12. Okay, so for this, if you go back and look at the data set, it actually tells you that the scale was from 1 to 4, and it gives you value labels for 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? If you go and look at the data, let's do that. If you go and look at the actual data, self-esteem, it says, so 1 was strongly disagree, 2 was agree, 3 was, oh, that really should be, that should be disagree, sorry. Strongly disagree, agree, and strongly agree. Okay, so it gives you very clear categories, labels for each number. So what that means is that if you have an average of 3.12, that average is between agree and strongly agree on the 4-point scale, and a little closer to agree, right? 3.12 is stronger to 3, which is the value of agree, than 4, which is strongly agree. Okay, so whenever you can, be as precise as possible in terms of interpreting the mean in relation to what it actually means relevant to the value labels. Okay. So that's reporting and interpreting the representative value, typically the mean, and interpreting it in the context of the question wording and value labels. Number 5, for numeric variables, you're going to report the standard deviation and interpret it. And this just means interpreting the standard deviation, just like we learned in lecture, right? So a standard deviation of 1.96, that indicates that the average person's score from the mean varied from the mean by 1.69 points. Okay, so that's pretty simple. Just report and interpret the standard deviation for numeric variables. You're also describing the shape of the distribution, saying whether it's symmetrical or skewed, and if it's skewed, indicate which direction, right? Whether it's a positive or negative skew. And you're going to explicitly refer to the bar plot or the histogram and the skewness statistic in order to kind of make this conclusion about it being symmetric or skewed and in what direction. So here's what this looks like here. So you say from an inspection of the histogram, see figure 1, and you can see I've inserted the histogram for COVID worried right below that. Inspection of the histogram, it's clear that the distribution was slightly positively skewed because the skewness value is 0.174, and you can see, just from looking at it, that it's slightly positively skewed. So that is that part, interpreting the shape using the histogram and skewness value. And then finally, you're kind of the last step is just making a broad or general kind of a conclusion statement about what this variable tells us. And in here, you also want to include any notable exceptions to the general information that you described above. And this is a little hard to tell what I mean here unless we have some specific example to work with. Okay, so here's what this could look like for the COVID worried variable. So you want to say, so overall, most respondents were not very worried about getting COVID, right? We get that information from the mean. And also, you can see with the histogram, the responses are piled up at the low end of being worried about COVID. So most people weren't worried, but there was some variation, right? Because there was a minority of students who reported worry scores quite a bit above the mean. Okay, so most people weren't worried, but there were some people who were very, very worried. So that's what number 7 looks like. Number 7 for the average self-esteem variable, it's a little bit longer. So it doesn't, there's variations of how you can do this and it can look different ways, but how I wrote it out was, overall then respondents reported fairly good self-esteem, right? On average, they tended to agree with questions that assessed how good they felt about themselves, right? This is what we see here, this bump towards the upper end of the self-esteem variable. But you say, there was some variation as a minority of students reported very low average self-esteem. I mean, so, because there's some students who are around there, right? So their scores are landing around disagree with questions that assessed how good they felt about themselves. And there were also another larger minority with very high self-esteem. Okay, so again, there's different ways that you could do this, but in general, you're reporting on making a conclusion about what this variable says, and is there any kind of notable exceptions to these average patterns that you've been reporting on. All right, and then there's another example that I've given of a write-up for the countries variable. So I'll let you walk through that yourself, but I've annotated how each sentence relates to the instructional points here. And for the assignment that you do for this lab, essentially what I'm going to do is have you write a descriptive report of at least one of the following variables that are taken from the World Values Survey. Okay, so that's why I said to prepare for the lab assignment, it'll make your life a lot easier if you download the data set in the Topic 2 assignment folder and just familiarize yourself with these variables ahead of time. Okay, so maybe look at the survey information file, read all of this information on these variables, and then when you go into the lab, your assignment will be, I'll pick, say 1 or 2 of these variables, and I'll say, okay, now you have to write a descriptive report, just like is illustrated in the instructions above here on these variables, and that's what you're going to be marked on. All right, so if you do all that, you familiarize yourself with the variables before lab, you should have no problem with the assignment. All right, that's it.